This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Looking to start a side hustle or become your own boss? Do it with Shopify. Whether you're selling succulents or stilettos, Shopify has the industry-leading tools to help you create, control, and grow your own business. So get serious about selling and get Shopify today. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.co.uk/special offer.
Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process in discussions between the authors, narrators, producers, and post-production teams that bring them all together, as well as guests who have listened to the audiobooks and have questions for the creative teams. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. And I'm so excited to have with me today Janja Lalich, author of Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships, the third edition. So Janja, PhD, is a professor emerita of sociology and founder and CEO of the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion. She's been studying cults and extremism since the late 1980s and has presented at both domestic and international conferences, as well as for intelligence organizations in the U.S. and elsewhere. She's recognized nationally and internationally for her work for and with survivors, families, and professionals, and has been an expert witness in both criminal and civil cases. So, Janja, I want to welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So I know this is not your first book about cults. Tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book and sort of lay out for us, for our listeners that maybe haven't heard any of your book yet or read it, sort of part of your journey in bringing this material forward.
Sure. Well, the first edition of this book was in 1994, and it was called Captive Hearts, Captive Minds. And at that point, I had been out of the cult that I was in for about 10 years. And sometimes I wonder how I ever got it together to even do that. And then it was reissued. That publisher went out of business. And so I found another publisher and reissued it in 2006 with the new title, Take Back Your Life. And then that publisher retired. And so he gave me back the rights to the book. And at that point, I decided, rather than hunt around for a publisher, which could take forever, as you probably know, I decided to publish it through my nonprofit, the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion. And I felt it was important to update a lot of the book. When it was first written, for example, there was hardly anything known about complex PTSD. And complex PTSD is somewhat different from regular PTSD, and it is typically what survivors of cults have. And so there's quite a bit of information on that now in the new edition, as well as I removed some of the older accounts and updated it with newer accounts, personal accounts of different people who were in cults that were a little more relevant today than what was happening back in the 90s. And then I just, updated and revised quite a lot of other parts of it. And I felt it was important to do. Well, first of all, the book was going out of print, and I got so many requests for it. And it took me, of course, much longer than I expected to do all the updating and revising because of everything else I'm always doing. So I was pretty delighted when it came out at the end of the year in the hard copy. And then, of course, went back to you to do the audio version, which you had also done the audio version of the last edition.
Right. Yeah. And as you were coming out with the third edition and making these updates, were there things about the material that you were changing or adding that felt like even more important to get out? Or, what were there any things that you were seeing that you felt like, oh, this, I've got to have this in there, because I didn't make it clear enough, or situations have changed. Did you have any experiences like that?
Well, I think the important thing, as I mentioned earlier, was about complex PTSD. And one of the reasons I think that the book has sold as well as it has over the years is because people who leave cults have such a hard time finding helpful resources, and in particular, therapists who understand how to work with cult survivors, who understand the cult after effects. So the book has, for example, a checklist of how to find a good therapist. And a lot of revisions, there is actually a section for therapists and a lot of revisions and updated material to that section, because I think aside from the trauma and the experience and the whole process of healing and recovery, finding helping professionals who can really help you is difficult. I mean, there's always a cost issue, people being able to afford it.
Right, especially after coming out of a cult.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And then also just finding the right person to work with you. I mean, people have had such horrendous experiences. Just last week, a woman was telling me her story. At the end of her telling her therapist her story and why she was coming for therapy, the therapist looked at her and said, "Well, why didn't you just leave?" And I'm like, "Oh my God." This is what happened 25 years ago with domestic violence, right? Like the cops go to the door and then they'd turn around and walk away.
Yeah.
And of course, we've done a lot of education in that area. And so we need to do a lot of education in this area. I mean, there are more cults than ever before, more types of cults, including now the internet-based cults and the cults in the business world, which is very rampant. And so, so I'm determined, even after I'm gone, which God knows, I mean, it just turned 79. I want to make sure this book stays in print, and hopefully you can help with that.
Yeah.
It's just so valuable.
I agree. There's so much. As I was reading it, and for our listeners, we'll get into this a little bit more, but I had the great honor and pleasure to be the main narrator for the book, for the audiobook. But as I was reading it, I realized, there's so much that should be foundational education, just foundational. And I know that you have made tremendous efforts to get into educational systems so that we don't have to live through the experience of being in a cult in order to figure out that, if I had only known that when this little, this would have raised a red flag. And that at times when I'm vulnerable, transition moments in my life, these are moments when I need to be especially watchful for red flags.
Yes.
Have you made progress? Do you feel like you've made progress in the educational world?
Well, I'd like to think we've made some progress, but honestly, Becky, when I was a professor, I taught for almost 20 years, at one of the California state universities. And I was able to, and I had a course designed on cults and charisma. And I was able to teach that course 4 times in the 20 years.
That's it?
Students loved the course. In one class, students even wrote a letter and all of them signed it and delivered it to the president of the university and said, this course should be taught every semester and should be required.
Yeah.
But no, I got to teach it 4 times. Only because we were so short-staffed that, of course, we had to teach the core courses. So it wasn't like anybody hated me and that's why they didn't give me the course.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, trying to get into the public school system, that's practically impossible. And it still is, because they're afraid you're going to talk about religion. And in America, we're not allowed to talk about religion. And I always say to them, I can talk about cults for a month solid and not even mention religion. It's not about religion. It's about structures and practices that harm and abuse people. So it's really an uphill battle. It has been. I think there has been progress only because, and this has happened, I think, since the pandemic, there's been more of an awareness in the general public. And part of that is due to everything that happened during the sheltered-in year with all the conspiracy theories and the anti-vax movement and QAnon and people falling down these rabbit holes, and the unfortunate president we had at the time encouraging that kind of us versus them thinking, which is a hallmark of a
Right.
cult.
Right.
And then,
And still doing so.
yes,
His cult is fully active.
yes. And then there have been really some terrific documentaries. And I think people started, again, during the pandemic, people were watching a lot of TV, whatever. And the documentaries that came out in the past few years, I think haven't solely focused on the blood and gore and sex, but they have been quite educational. And so I think there is a greater awareness, which doesn't mean my job or anybody's job in this field is any simpler. It just means that more people are waking up and catching on and finding out and leaving and asking for help and filing legal cases, which is excellent. We've seen some pretty notorious cult leaders get convicted in the last few years.
Yeah, thank goodness. And do you see any, do you have any sense of trends in terms of people being able to get out of, like escaping cults? Do we know? I mean, it seems like a lot of that information would be hard to even track.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify. Absolutely. I mean, I'm just working right now on creating a course for therapists that'll be a CE, offer CE credits. And I'm working with a psychologist on the course. And, we want to be able to cite data that says this many people have found it a hard time to find a therapist, and it's hard to find that kind of statistical information. There's lots of anecdotes, I have thousands and everybody else I know in the field has thousands, but no, there haven't really been any really good scientific studies that we can show this is really a need.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I want to ask you about something else that showed up for me in the book as I was preparing. And so it was the first time I came across, the mention of Christian Science, because I was brought up in Christian Science and I had never thought of it as a cult. So that was the moment of like seeing that, and was really interesting for me because it sort of stopped me and I thought, well, was that? And it was interesting because the leader, of course, is dead, has been dead for long gone, but the religion or cult continues on. Now, in my own experience, my parents were not so strict that they weren't like, no, you have to. There was a lot of thought reform going on, but they weren't. My parents weren't rigid within that. But
did they deny you medical care?
There were a few moments when I had medical care. I got glasses, so that was something. I did go to the dentist, and I broke my arm in high school, and I did get a cast. So they did take me to the hospital, so I wasn't completely without care. But I did lose a sister who later, when she was 25 at the time, and I was 22, and I had left Christian Science at that point. And so half of our family was in and half of our family was out. And she was in, and she had one of the most curable cancers, melanoma, but didn't get care. I think by the time she realized it was really a problem, not something that was just going to go away. Because you grow up without any sense of
exactly
what to do. I mean, I've struggled. I've throughout my life, I felt like, well, I don't really feel like I have a grounding in what my options are from a medical perspective, just because I'm, so I rely on other family and friends, to sort of provide some guidance. But it was really interesting. And it makes me wonder how many others who are raised in cults actually recognize that they are in one or not.
Well, the issue of children raised in cults is one of my, I don't know exactly what to call it. It's for me, it's one of the most difficult issues because in a way it's still so unrecognized. So there's two things I want to say about that. First of all, in relation to your experience, everybody in a cult is going to have a different experience, and not everybody's experience is going to be hugely traumatic or awful or wonderful. And because there's a range of experiences, often you will get people who will say, oh, well, I was in that cult and it was just fine. That may be true, but that doesn't take away from the fact that for someone else, it might have been truly awful. And this comes up a lot. I mean, even when I left the cult I was in a political cult for 10 years, a left-wing cult. And our cult imploded, which is very unusual. Everybody got out. And so we had these sort of, back in the day, we used to call these speaking bitterness sessions, where we sat in our print shop for a couple of weeks and people just kind of poured their hearts out, telling what they had been living through for the past 10 years. And then we all kind of went our separate ways. And when I had been in the cult, I had always been in leadership. I was in the inner circle. I knew a lot. And I witnessed and experienced a lot. And there were also people, and we had levels of membership. And so there were people on the outer rings who, some of them never even saw the leader, never met the leader.
Oh, interesting.
Did sort of political work on the streets for us or whatever, right? They didn't have a clue what went on. But when I wrote my first article about my experience in the group, some people went ballistic and they were like, oh, she's making that up. That never happened. She's exaggerating. And I'm like, wait a minute, you were not there. You were not sitting there in the living room with the leader when she was drunk and hitting people and doing this, that, and the other. I mean, and so it's important to recognize these varying experiences. And sometimes people on the side of what we call cult apologists, want to use that to basically dismiss people who have actual traumatic experiences. And they'll say, oh, well, they're just, sour grapes and they're upset because they got kicked out or whatever. Right.
Right.
So I think that's one thing I just want to clarify. But in terms of children, and that's what the last book I did, Escaping Utopia, is about kids who were raised in cult. And I interviewed about 69 kids, adults, who had left on their own, and basically was looking at how did they manage in the world when they got out? Because depending on the group you were in, people get out of these cults. They don't know their real name. They don't have a birth certificate. They don't know if they have any relatives out there anywhere. They don't know how to get a GED. They end up living on the streets. There's hundreds of suicides. I mean, it's just tragic. And I call it the number one public health issue that nobody talks about, right? They can go to a domestic violence shelter and they'll get turned away. They don't qualify, right? So that's a whole issue there of the people who grow up in cults. And while I was doing that research and interviewing people, I mean, the issue came up about resilience. I mean, this is to get to your question, like, do people realize it? And I tried to look at the research on resilience, like why were some kids in these groups able to break away sooner, able to kind of realize that there's something wrong here, that this isn't the way life should be, even though they didn't go to schools outside the cult, even though they had no outside experience. There was something within them that knew this isn't right, like kind of this innate ethical system or moral system, right? And I couldn't find anything that told me why some kids have that over other kids, right? I mean, I think there is no answer to that. So, and often it is much later that they do leave usually when they're, I'd say most kids leave in their early 20s, when they're able to think that they can somehow survive on their own. And it's difficult. I mean, you probably know this. You can lose everything. You lose your family, you lose your friend, you lose the whole world that was everything to you, that was all you knew. In most cases, I don't know so much about Christian Science, but in most cases, you're taught, the outside world is evil. They're going to hate you out there. You're going to die out there. It's going to be awful out there. And so there's that fear. And, one of the things, the people I interviewed, one of the things I loved was they said, I was so struck by how nice people were. I wasn't expecting people to be so nice. It's like, we're just humans out here,
Yeah.
So I don't know if that really answers your question, but
yeah, it did. I was.
Did it make you want to stop reading the book when you got to that? You're like,
no,
oh.
I was all the more intrigued because I just because I'd never even considered that. I got to where I went off to college, and my friends started asking me questions, and this was at a point where I thought, I really got it. I really understand it. And I was like, I can't answer that question in any way that I believe. It's like the whole denial of what the physical experience. I'm having this experience. Now you're telling me it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's what I was bumping up against my entire life and thinking I'm supposed to be perfect. And then, well, I know I'm not perfect. I could tell that.
Right.
Right. So it caused a lot of problems along the way. But then my last encounter with it really was when my mom was near the end of her life, and she was still in Christian Science. And I thought she would appreciate having someone come and read to her. So I called the local church, and so someone started doing that. And then, but my mom I had started taking her for acupuncture and chiropractic because that seemed to be really helping her feel better. Mm-hmm. Well, they called once when I had taken her to the chiropractor, and they were so outraged. They said, "We can't see her anymore." And I thought, that is supposed to be a loving response? I was so furious. Oh my gosh, I was so furious. And I just, that was it for me. So,
well, who said they couldn't see her anymore?
The person at the church, the Christian Science church, refused to. It's like they weren't going to have anyone come and read to my mom anymore because she had violated the code of ethics. By going to a chiropractor.
So that tells you something right there, right?
Yeah. So, it's quite the experience. But I'm glad to have had this moment of recognition that is that's what that was.
Have you looked for any material or any memoirs by Christian Science?
You mean in terms of other authors who have written memoirs? I haven't. I haven't.
Yeah, the only one I'm familiar with is from years ago. It's called Blue Window, and I forget who the author is. I actually have it, and actually some of the material in I actually don't want to out anybody, but some of the material in Take Back Your Life is by someone who was a Christian Scientist. I don't know if you can imagine who that might be, since you're pretty familiar with the book. But
yeah, I am familiar with the book, but I will just let our listeners and readers make their own guesses. I want to let's just take a short pause, and we'll be right back.
Okay, sure.
Cult victims and those who have suffered abusive relationships often suffer from fear, confusion, low self-esteem, and post-traumatic stress. Take Back Your Life explains the seductive draw that leads people into such situations, provides guidelines for assessing what happened, and hands-on tools for getting back on track. Written for the victims, their families, and professionals, this book leads readers and listeners through the healing process. A resource list and numerous personal accounts of those who have successfully made the transition to the normal world provide help and inspiration. And according to Philip G. Zimbardo, PhD, professor of psychology at Stanford University, this is must reading for everyone who wants to understand the appeal of cults. This book's wisdom is vital. And you can find Take Back Your Life on Amplify Audiobooks. Get your audiobooks there. Okay, and we're back. So you had mentioned the rise in cults, and you think that was... Talk to me a little bit more about some of the reasons why you think that is, that we're experiencing that.
Well, I think it started way before the pandemic. A lot of it came out of what we call the New Age movement. So the New Age movement, which was really popular in the, say, 80s and into the 90s, but late 70s into the 80s, right? Where you had, this really wild interest in things not of this world, so to speak, right? So you had, people buying crystals, and you had people talking to dead people, channelers, and you had a TV show with ghosts in it. And, all of this stuff became very, very popular, right? It was like everyday stuff. And out of that, of course, came people who were going to take advantage of that, right? Because there's always people in this world like that, apparently. So
Sadly.
you suddenly have this woman who says she's channeling 300-year-old beings and giving you financial advice. And then came sort of the growth of sort of pop psychology and a lot of very questionable kinds of therapies, UFO therapy and rebirthing and all of these kinds of things. So there came to be a lot of what we might call therapy cults, people getting into something that was really odd, and the person leading it, the therapist leading it, taking advantage of people and forming a little cult around themselves. And then it went into the business world. So we started to have what were called, those of us researching these movements, called large group awareness trainings. So you had these self-help, self-improvement, leadership, management training. Boom, and that's still everywhere today. And many people in their workplaces get sent to these programs and essentially can't say, no, I don't want to go, because it's a job requirement, or they think they're going to be ostracized by their coworkers or whatever. So it's come into us that way. So that in itself was a huge explosion over what started out. I mean, there have always been cults, first of all, but what started out as, the real recognition of it, which happened in the late 60s, early 70s, right, with the what we called the Jesus movement and the Hare Krishnas and the Moonies and all these children of God, these groups that really became pretty well known in the States at the time. But then it has mushroomed in that way into these different avenues. And then you saw a lot of people broke off from something they were in and then started their own thing. Or some of these trainers in these large group awareness programs broke off and started their own crazy little training program, right?
Yeah. Do you think there's also an increase in the pathology, the narcissism and sociopath? Do you think that we're seeing an increase in that as well?
Well, we're seeing an increase in the recognition of it and people catching on to it, which is great. And then sometimes it's a little overdone, like suddenly everybody's a narcissist, right? And we need to be a little bit careful of going too far with that stuff.
Right. Yeah.
But so I do think there was this growth. And, the reality is, Becky, there's just always going to be people who want to take advantage of other people. As my mentor, Margaret Singer, would say, con artists are a dime a dozen. They're everywhere. They're always going to be there wanting to take advantage of you. And unfortunately, those who don't just run regular old scams, but those who start cults are often what we might call malignant narcissists. And that's when the bad stuff really happens. That's when you get a Jonestown and some of these really tragic things, Branch Davidians, things we've seen over the years, and the horrific abuse, the physical abuse, sexual abuse. And then I think this new surge happened when the internet became popular, so that we started to see what I call the old brick and mortar cults. They were really easy to identify. You knew where they were. You knew who the leader was. You knew where their outlets were. But with the internet cults, they're much harder to identify. And, so you take something like QAnon, if you want to call that a cult, right? I mean, who was the leader of QAnon? Was it that man and his son? Who was it? And then the anti-vaxxers kind of just mushroomed, and it could be just a little local community, or it could be, and that just all went ballistic. And so people being recruited over the internet, that was a relatively new phenomenon. I'd say it started in the late 90s, but it got really big during the pandemic.
I'm sure, yeah, because we all kind of felt isolated at that point.
Exactly.
And like, what else could we do to try to find our community aside from our small pod that we were letting ourselves,
be within 6 feet of, right?
Right. Yeah. So I could see how just kind of that surge in need, in vulnerability, would put so many people at risk.
Yeah.
I think also our media is not there's so much disinformation out there now that it makes it all the more challenging to really determine. And this is where I think, just circling back to the education piece, where I think it's the skills we need, our children, all of us need the skills to determine, to really evaluate for ourselves, not just accept, but evaluate and analyze. Is this real, what I'm hearing? Is this not real? How do I know? The internet makes it especially hard.
Yeah. Although, on the other hand, it's a double-edged sword. There's a lot of good information on the internet. I mean, if you're thinking of joining something, put in the name of that group and then type in criticism and see what comes up. And 9 times out of 10, you'll find things from people who were part of that who didn't have the greatest experiences. And I think that, I think part of it is when the more we became this really fast-paced society of quick fix, looking for the quick fix. And, people didn't want to do years of therapy. They wanted, this self-improvement program is going to fix you on a 5-day retreat. So I think that lent to people joining up with things that they otherwise shouldn't have. And I always say, think about it like you're buying a car. You never buy the first car you look at, right? And you get the blue book or whatever, or the Consumer Reports, and you read about the different models, and you ask people, well, you owned a Ford EcoSport. What did you think of it? Was it a good car? You drive it around, you do, and do the same thing when you're about to sign your life away. Ask a lot of questions, check things out, talk to people who left. If they're not answering your questions, that's one of the first signs of something's going to go wrong. You ask a question and they'll say, oh, that's a great question, but take one more course and then you'll have the answer to that question. Or, you don't know quite enough yet to ask that question.
Yeah.
If it gets turned back on you, run the other way.
Yeah.
So people need to just slow down.
Yeah. Well, let's chat a little bit about the audiobook production process and what that's been like, because this is not your first time through the audiobook process. Is there anything that kind of stands out to you about this time round?
Well, last time I didn't really have much to do with it. I just said, go do it. And we found someone to narrate it and off we went. I think I did have to review it. And so for me, I mean, I was delighted when you said you wanted to narrate the book, because that felt great, that you had that kind of interest and support for what we're doing. And then I had part of the other process for me was to listen to the various people who were auditioning to read the personal accounts, because we had decided when you and I talked about it to have different voices for that, to just change it up a little bit. And that was really tough, because I would listen to these little snippets by these people and I'd say, oh, yeah, she sounds really good. And then I'd select her and then I'd hear it again and I'd go, oh, my God, did I choose that person? And frankly, I was amazed at how many offerings there were. I mean, that there were so many people who, I guess, do this for a living. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And so I listened to the female voices, I listened to the male voices, and that was fantastic. And I hope I picked good voices.
I think you did.
And then I did a little bit of the reading myself, which I didn't do last time. So I went to this studio in Oakland, in Berkeley, and that was a really incredible experience. And I thought I was going to be there for hours. I was there for like maybe 45 minutes, and I read just the intro and the acknowledgments and my poem, which is in the book. And that was interesting for me to do that, because I'd never done anything like that before. And the guy, what's he called? The
engineer. The engineer.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the engineer and I had a very special connection, and he was really so excited about the book and the content. And so we chatted for a little bit. And working with Elias has been wonderful. He's been great. And then the thing was done, and I was supposed to listen to all of it. And I have to admit, I didn't listen to all of it. I listened to a lot of it, but it just would have taken so much time. And I trusted that you all did a good job and caught some of the errors, which it looked like you had caught. So I trusted that. And I just think your company is great. I mean, everybody that I've worked with has been so professional and fast. And I'm amazed how fast this got done, because it's a fat book. And it's a big book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
So
great.
And, I just had it translated into Spanish. So I don't know if you have any Spanish speakers.
We do. We have lots of Spanish speakers.
You do?
Yeah, so we could do that.
Okay. Well, if I can raise the money, maybe we should do that one next.
All right. That sounds good. That's good. I want to mention to our listeners, because we're going to be having you again on the podcast a little later with another one of our wonderful authors, Bruce Neuberger, who has written Postcards to Hitler, a German Jew's Defiance in a Time of Terror. And I, as a narrator in both those projects, I saw some very interesting overlaps in content, some intersection points that I think will make for a fascinating discussion. So I want to let our listeners know.
That sounds really interesting. But is that one done? Is it out yet? Or
it is still in production. It's a full cast production. So we have, the subtitle says a lot about what it is, but it is a full cast. So we're in production now, and we're expecting it will be out this summer. So
that should be a really, really interesting.
Yeah. Some of the things, it was interesting as I was narrating your book, Take Back Your Life, and then directing the other project and getting to these moments where it was like describing exactly what you had just described.
Wow.
Was taking place in Nazi Germany. So, fascinating.
Oh, that should be really interesting.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, there's the work of Robert Lifton. You know, Robert Lifton is kind of the originator, I guess, or the first person to study thought reform or brainwashing. And he wrote a book called The Nazi Doctors, which was about German doctors who would go to the camps every day and carry out these horrific experiments and send people to the ovens and all of that. And then he'd come home and he'd just be like the nice doctor with his son sitting on his lap, eating dinner, being at home. And apparently there's this movie right now. I haven't seen it yet. The Something of Iron. I think it might have won an award, but it's about one of the top Germans who lived right next door to Auschwitz, and how his wife is planting a garden and, just doing the whole thing. And it's just that dilemma of that incredible cognitive dissonance, that people just won't see what's happening.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm anxious to meet Dr. Is he a Dr. Neuberger?
I think it's just Bruce Neuberger. Yeah. I hesitate when I say his last name because we use the German pronunciation in the book because all of it would have been German, Neuberger, but he pronounces it Neuberger. So, well, I want to make sure that our listeners know how they can learn more about you, your writing, your work. I know that this content is so, so important to people, and I want to do whatever I can to help get the word out. Where should they go?
Well, I do have a nonprofit called the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion, and people can go there and they can donate if they want to help pay Becky here, and they can
they can fund the Spanish edition.
Right. And yes, exactly. And there's some information there. And then I also have a personal website, janjalalich.com. There's quite a bit of information and material there. I'm in the process of writing a memoir, I guess, like everyone else. And one day that'll be out. And I am also pulling together a project of all the things that I've written over the years, which I've discovered. It's a massive amount of material. It'll probably be a couple of volumes. And I'm putting it into categories, on terrorism, on families, blah, blah, blah. And so that'll be called Janja Writes, the collected works of Janja Lalich. So maybe within a year, that one will be out. But I'd say I'm most proud of Take Back Your Life and Escaping Utopia about the children. And they complement each other quite a bit. But I can't tell you the messages I get from around the world. In fact, here's an interesting point. A woman contacted me recently who's been translating my books in Iran into Farsi. She's a political prisoner. She said my book saved her life while she was in jail. And I have a guy who just contacted me 2 weeks ago who wants to translate Take Back Your Life into Sinhala, which is the language of Sri Lanka.
Wow.
Who knew? There are cults everywhere.
Yeah. And we can do whatever languages you want.
Yeah, okay.
We've got you covered when you're in the audio world. And also just a reminder for our listeners to get their audiobook edition of Take Back Your Life at Amplify Audiobooks. That helps Janja the most and is the best way for all of us to have a positive impact in the world. So, Janja, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, thank you, Becky, and thanks for all your hard work.
Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.